Are those sanctions starting to bite? On the surface of it, it's business as usual for Russia that Saturday took over the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council and it still enjoys plenty of support from the likes of China. Still, last week, Vladimir Putin, for the first time, telling his cabinet to expect trouble ahead. While Europe's now come out of a mild winter with only mild discomfort from that cut in Russian gas, oil prices have failed to meet Moscow's expectations. Russia's already been selling crude at a discount. We'll ask if that's about to all change and whether Moscow can benefit. Fact is, those oil exports have continued out of Russia, much to the delight of the likes of India. What's next on that score? And more broadly, how has the invasion of Ukraine affected Russia's standing amongst a developing world impacted by inflation and supply chain disruptions? A lot hinges on what happens now on the battlefield in Ukraine. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if the sanctions on Russia are starting to sting. Joining us, economics professor Anna Creddy, who's with Paris Dauphine University's Center for Geopolitics of Energy and Raw Materials. Welcome back to the show. From Vilnius, Alexandra Filipenko of the Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
From Oslo, Sunny Kapoor, Managing Director of the consultancy Redefine. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Daniel Tannenbaum is with us from New York City. He is Global Anti-Financial Crime Leader at Management Consultants Oliver Wyman, Senior Fellow as well at the Atlantic Council think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It was a first since the start of Russia's so-called special military operation that began in February of last year. The president telling his cabinet last week in televised remarks to brace for the sting of sanctions.
The illegitimate restrictions imposed on the Russian economy in the medium term can indeed have a negative impact on it. In this regard, we need to ensure a sustainable increase in domestic demand. In this situation, it is this that becomes the leading factor in economic growth.
Alexandra Filipenko, what was behind that statement?
Well, it seems that Russia is really starting to feel what is happening right now. And Putin is increasingly replacing the political mechanisms of ruling the country. And now he is trying to make everyone realize and understand why this war is still, why it can still go on. Because as we know, as we remember, in the first weeks, in the first days of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, President Putin was hinting that it will last not for a long period of time, that it will come to an end really fast. And he never stated any goals, but the backdrop was that Russians will not feel anything. Russians will not really feel anything economically, that's for sure. And now he has to change the pace, and now he has to tell through the propaganda. He has to tell the Russian people why they are feeling something, and they have to be at good terms with it, because Russians do not really understand why this war is still going on, and why the economy is going down, and why the products are becoming more and more expensive. So this is the change of pace and the change of rhetoric also from the Kremlin that is explaining to the Russians that they need to be ready for a long war.
Yeah, so you need to explain the pain and not stay silent about it. On the eve, by the way, of the arrest of the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich in Yekaterinburg, the journal had co-authored a piece about how a year of sanctions and the fleeing abroad of bright minds had taken a toll. The government's energy revenue fell by nearly half in the first 2 months of this year compared with last year, while the budget deficit deepened. Daniel Tannenbaum, the sting felt, but how much is it really being felt? Because some have been arguing up to now that it was actually less than expected. You remember those predictions that once sanctions began, that the infrastructure on oil and gas would crumble.
I mean, let's be clear. We have not seen the mother of all sanctions that President Biden had promised last February. But it's important to note that we don't really know how impacted the Russian economy is. There's only so much you can trust the data coming out of the Central Bank of Russia. But we know that sanctions take time to take hold. They're not something that has any great immediacy. Over time, it begins to atrophy and isolate an economy. And frankly, the only reason why Russia is not the most sanctioned country in the world, and it's very important to note that it is not the most sanctioned country in the world, is because so many sectors like energy, like precious metals, are still needed by the West. But to be very frank, the West is rapidly trying to find alternative solutions to really reduce Russia to economic irrelevance.
Yeah, and the pinch is there again in that Wall Street Journal article. They talk about the oil revenues being down, as well as investment, Anacreti, in oil and gas exploration and production. $33 billion this year, from a predicted $57 billion before the invasion. Can Russia, picking up on what you just heard there from Daniel Tannenbaum, can Russia be in a state of autarky and self-sufficiency, and at the end of the day, those precious metals, are they going to be able to find them elsewhere? That oil and gas, is the West going to be able to find it elsewhere?
Well, the question is just which ingredients we may want to combine. On one side, we have the volume of exports, and on the other side, we have their value. So it is true that in terms of volume, gas and oil were the major part of their external trade, and we don't have to mean they were taking most of the part of the added value in the Russia supply chains. Precious metals are still important, especially also for the energy transition, which is a little bit contradictory of the European countries or Western countries, but they do not sell at the same price and they don't have the same volume, so they cannot compensate exactly the losses that Russia has in decreasing the export to Europe. But on the other side, especially oil, is a global commodity. So all the question is, on one side, how much of the oil that was expected to go to Europe is actually flowing or not, and whether the share of the oil that is not going to Europe has been reshuffled towards other countries, and which are the revenues that Russia is still going. So it is true that Russia is insulated also. The financial sector is, is more and more difficult to reach directly in Russia. There are all the foreign companies that, European or not, they have run away from Russia, and this is also affecting the supply of the basic goods. That is why they also have inflation. But on the other side, Russia has been also giving 3% of their GDP in measures like we have done in Europe in order to counteract the effect of inflation. They are sustaining the ruble with high interest rate. So it is like catching up. Everything that they can have as a difficulty in their economy, they try to compensate somehow.
Sonny Kapoor, the Russians still have a huge sovereign wealth fund. When you think back 13 months, is Moscow in the place you think it would have been?
Yes and no. So similar to the rhetoric on the Russian side about how it was going to overrun Ukraine and the expectation generally at senior levels within just a few days, there was also an exaggerated rhetoric from the West as to the immediacy and the effect of sanctions. And clearly neither of them have come to pass because the Russians didn't count on Ukrainian resistance and aid coming in from the West. and the West didn't really take into account the cat and mouse games that all sanctions are. Every effort to sanction is followed by efforts to evade. And this is a well-established cat and mouse game that we've seen in Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, etc. Now, it's important to distinguish, to understand what's going on between three different kinds of sanctions. The first, most sort of immediate sanctions that we in the West thought would have a substantial impact was the confiscation of Russian wealth, both of oligarchs and of the state, in the form of central bank reserves. Now, clearly, that is a contentious issue. Whether that will be used to fund Ukrainian reconstruction or not is being currently debated. But, you know, if you have sort of money in the bank and that gets frozen, that doesn't take away your income. It's only when you need to use it, right? So it hasn't had that immediate effect in the economy. The second is the sanctions on exports, and in particular, earning revenues in dollars and euros. And that's where we see sort of the cat and mouse game. And also, I think a very important fact that Dennis pointed out, it is not in the West's interest, and the West, including the EU and the United States, have not wanted Russian oil, gas, minerals, fertilizer, and food to disappear from global markets. Because if that were to happen, Russia is such a major exporter of all of these, then we would indeed see financial, economic, inflation crisis, several orders of magnitude bigger than the dislocations we saw last year, right? So we have basically said that, look, we don't want to be privy to delivering revenues to Russia from these exports, but we do want these exports to go into the global market. So it's led to a dislocation of trade rather than reducing the volumes of Russian exports. And then the third, an underappreciated aspect of sanctions, which I think will be in some ways, you know, perhaps the most destructive long term, is the sanctions on imports, restrictions on imports of high value added goods, of equipment that is high value added, of technology, of chips, etc. And that is starting to have a slow but sure impact on Russian productivity. And I think the Wall Street Journal piece you pointed to very rightly points to the fact that Russian long-term growth potential has shifted dramatically on a downward trajectory. So will the sanctions get Putin to pull out of Ukraine? No, because he did not go into Ukraine for economic reasons. It was ideological. And now he's painted himself into such a corner that it's become existential. He cannot exit with egg on his face. And he's locked in, irrespective of the very large and increasing price that the Russian economy and Russian citizens, many of whom are innocent bystanders in this, will have to pay.
But I want to talk about this cat and mouse game more. But first, I just want to briefly ask Alexandra Filipenko, that Wall Street Journal article. Now, in the past, the Russians just didn't really care how their country was covered in the West because their domestic audience didn't read it much. Do you think that article was a factor in the arrest of Evan Gershkovich?
I think that article was a factor, but this is, first of all, a signal to all foreign journalists and to all journalists who still stay in Russia. So, of course, Russian audience, the Russians, they don't really read the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post or New York Times or anything in the English language mostly. And all the news, most of the news are blocked, and you cannot get, you cannot get New York Times, even if you're a subscriber, if you're in Russia, only using a VPN and etc. So you cannot really get those news. But for the Kremlin, it's still important how it is viewed in the world, maybe not in the West anymore, but in China, in India, in the rest of the world. It's important for them to be viewed favorably and economically favorably. So I think that had a lot to do, that article had a lot to do, and maybe it was the last drop for the Kremlin to arrest the journalist. But to me personally, I think this is a signal to all foreign journalists and to anyone who is writing about Russia from Russia that they should get out as fast as possible, or write only within the framework of the Kremlin and only write what is favorable to Kremlin. So for me, I think this is mostly a sign rather than something that has to do with the economics. And another point about Evan Gershkovich, it is said that he was writing an article about Wagner Group, about Mr. Prigozhin, who is recruiting people in the prisons and being very active in the war front. And he just today he announced that they got Bakhmut. So he was probably, maybe he was writing an article about Prigozhin, and I think that might have even more to do with the arrest than the economic side.
So back to that cat and mouse game that Sonny Kapoor was describing. Daniel Tannenbaum, we had a visit back in February of the U.S. Secretary of State to Turkey. And since that time, it's been reported, including no later than last week by Le Monde, the French newspaper, how the exports from Turkey to Russia of those much needed finished goods that Sonny was describing have stopped. Is Washington getting better at the cat and mouse game?
Look, like anything else, it takes time. And I say this having worked at the U.S. Treasury Department dealing with these issues when Iran was becoming a much bigger problem. If you look across the larger trading partners now of Russia, Turkey, the UAE, China, and India, and putting China aside, we've seen India signal that they'll conform to the Russia oil price cap. We've seen Turkey already kind of bow to some of that pressure with abandoning the mere payment system. Even as recently as last week, the UAE revoked the license of a Russian bank that was authorized to open up shop in Dubai last year to take in Russian deposits fleeing Russia and moving into the UAE. So this pressure is working. Again, I think the U.S. government has made very clear 2023 will be the year of enforcement. So as you began to focus primary sanctions directly on Russia, you're now beginning to look at those who continue to support them and their allies. And if I'm a country that has a heavy amount of trade to Russia, I'm going to be extremely nervous that I've got a bullseye on my back economically from the U.S. and its allies. And remember, over 140 countries have denounced this illegal invasion of Ukraine in the UN. There's not that many countries that are actively on the side of Russia in this. So those that are on the side of Russia risk their own trading status as a result of that continued activity.
Yeah, of course, Moscow may get a lifeline yet. Let's look at the current news cycle. Saudi Arabia leading the charge of OPEC plus nations with a surprise cut in crude production by those nations. More than $1 billion barrels a day. That's what was announced on Sunday. The price of oil starting the week up more than 6% in earlier trading. And a credit, it's still 1/3 less than last year's highs shortly after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, I realize Saudi Arabia's reasons for cutting production aren't to help Vladimir Putin necessarily, but is this a lifeline for Moscow?
Well, I think that during this last year, we already had this kind of announcement. It was made, the OPEC countries meet every 6 months. So the announcement is now a little bit ahead of the period of June, where they decide the quotas to each country to produce. And this is therefore the second time they announced to cut their production. With the double interest. One, it is directly to have an impact on the international oil price, because they always have this idea that they do compete with the United States in providing oil to basically all the world. And on the other side, we have to remind that Russia is part of what we call the OPEC plus, that is the first let's say, Arabian country that belongs to the cartel. And therefore, we may suspect that this is also in line with the expectation of Putin as it was in December.
So why would Saudi Arabia want to do favors for Vladimir Putin?
It is indirectly something that is profitable for Saudi Arabia and therefore also for Russia. They have an agreement that is implicit that started also far before the war. Whether it is an agreement that is directly with Putin, I don't think so. But it is where do they meet is the interest of trade and therefore to have a high price of oil. And the limit also of the $8 per barrel is to be maintained because we know that we have this cap on the oil price that is €60 for the trades in Europe. But we already know that some commercial exchanges have been done from Russia at 70, some of them at 40, depending on the country they have to sell. So implicitly, it is something that, again, it is decided in the first interest of OPEC, on the first line of countries, but also indirect benefit Russia.
Yeah, and we've seen all the stories, Sunny Kapoor, about oil tankers that turn off their transponders and this sort of thing. Are we headed for a sort of a chaotic world market when it comes to oil and gas?
Well, in some ways, we already are in the middle of it. The idea, and it's been sort of touted out a few times, that Russian oil is staying below the sanctioned price. Frankly, before we had clear data, every single transaction more or less was reported, could be checked. And now it's not so clear. And there are several layers of obscurity and deliberate obfuscation. So it's not even clear, how much Russian oil exactly is going to whom and is being sold exactly at what price, on what terms, through what channels. Similarly with, the so-called sort of shadow reserves, what has happened to the give or take a few billion, nearly $100 billion that Russia would have earned since the sanctions began last year. So about $300 billion of central bank reserves have been frozen. But what's happening to that $100 billion? Where is it being held? In what form? What currency? What accounts? It's a bit unclear. So yes, they with deliberate efforts on to hide both the physical reality, the pricing reality, the money flows, the beneficiaries, the oil and the gas market, and the related financial flows are less transparent. And if somebody wanted to have a clear global picture, there are several additional informational constraints. And I just wanted to apologize to Daniel for having misidentified him as Dennis. I've only recently got my glasses and I wasn't wearing them. I apologize.
Daniel Tannenbaum, I won't ask you if you take offense, but what the Saudis have done, is this completely unrelated to Russia?
Well, one, to address Sonny's point, I'm not offended the Russian government sanctioned me in November and spelled my name wrong and my company's name wrong. I'm quite used to this, actually. Is this unrelated? It's hard to say it's completely unrelated. Clearly, there are broader recessionary concerns on the horizon that are driving OPEC's desire to reduce production, obviously to manage price, which is their primary objective. I doubt this is entirely related, but I think given some of the pressure in the Middle East at the moment, particularly as the US, Europe, and UK are focused on economies seen to be harboring Russian assets, the last thing the Saudis want to be seen as a welcome provider of aid to the Russian economy at this point. So I do think there are some broader economic reasons for this move that aren't directly related to supporting the Russian economy and Russian interests.
Anna Credi, before we move on, let's talk about the local weather. There might be a frost here in Paris tonight, so if you have some strawberries, you might want to cover them up. But the good news, if you're a French person, is it's been a mild winter. We can show the graph put up by our friend Thierry Brosse on his Twitter feed, and this is EU storage levels. The line in red is 2023, the line in green is 2022. So the great gas shortage, the power outages that some predicted, they didn't happen.
Yes, this is the result of several effects. One is that, as you said, we had a winter that was mild, and we know that April and March is the time where in France and other countries, neighboring countries, we may have some peaks in terms of the demand. So this remains normal. On the other side, we don't have to forget that all the campaign for reducing the gas demand or in the residential and in the industrial sector, with all the campaign on sufficiency, with the restrictions in terms of how the industrial countries, the industrial production has saved gas. So it has been considered that overall in Europe, the reduction of gas demand was almost 10 to 12%. So it is both for the temperature and also for the efforts that have been done in terms of encouraging this decrease in the demand. We don't know yet whether this objective will remain as such. This is being discussed actually by the Ministry of Energy, whether the reduction of demand will carry on also for the next winter. We don't know if the habits of people in consuming gas will be consistently low, even if we see that we didn't have any kind of disruption. That is why it is sure that the storage levels are very high. We have also to recall that we had the imperative of filling the gas storage up to 90%, and some countries even 100%.
And there's more liquefied natural gas coming from places like the United States.
Yes, of course, from the United States, Norway, and everywhere. So Europe has imported a lot in order to compensate the partial, the reduction of the supply from Russia. So we have a lot of question marks for the next winter. The way in which we start now the season of refilling the storage is much more comfortable than how it was last year. So the signals are mixed. It depends on how the evolution of basically the demand is going to be.
One more question, and I'll put it to you, Sunny Kapoor, about this question of oil and gas. Before the invasion, Russia represented just a tiny fraction of India's oil imports. This February, we saw another all-time high with Russian crude imports for India higher than the combined imports from traditional suppliers, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. If the price of oil now goes up, is India going to be in a bind when it comes to its continued economic growth?
I think, the world owes India a vote of thanks, quite opposite to Germany, which has had a net export surplus. I think India, since independence, has been a net contributor to global demand. And the two biggest sources of current account deficits are India's obsession with gold, and the second has been oil and gas. India has very little domestic production, fast-growing economy. And yes, fluctuations in the price of oil do have a large macroeconomic impact on India. But to the extent the sanctions are effective, to the extent the $60 price cap does hold for Russian oil, it would make sense for a relatively poor, fast-growing emerging economy to get oil at $60, $55 if it can, even if the market price with OPEC cuts increases to $80 or $90. So it depends on the terms. But yes, everything else being the constant, any increase in oil prices do have a negative impact on the Indian economy. But I think given the current momentum in the Indian economy and what would potentially be a relatively small change in net price, and especially after 2022 having seen such high prices, it may not be a very large negative impact.
You know, we've had since the last 13 months, Sonny, this question of, what makes the most economic sense versus when you have, here in Europe, an existential threat for Ukraine, and when you have to put money aside. How do Indians feel about the war in Ukraine?
Well, in my circles at least, there is a very strong pro-Ukraine sentiment. But I think that the debate in Europe gets mischaracterized, sometimes as, the Indians are ambiguous on this issue, and India is being, opportunistic by sort of supporting Russia. Now, as you know, and India, a democratic sort of haven, surrounded by countries from Nepal to Sri Lanka to Burma to Pakistan to China, many of whom have non-democratic governments, two of whom have been to war with India, two of whom have nuclear weapons. And throughout sort of the post-World War II era, India was not allowed to import, even when it wanted to, sophisticated defense equipment from the United States. And it sort of ended up that India, a very, very large proportion of Indian Air Force, sophisticated naval and army equipment has come from Russia. And so even if India wanted to, it simply, from an existential threat perspective, cannot afford to suddenly cut ties with Russia because the vast stock of current of the whole sort of equipment in the armed forces is Russian. And so that's an important factor. Remember, the second last important point is that frankly, the EU and the United States do not want India to not buy Russian oil and gas and minerals. And it's because, as I said, nobody is ready for Russian exports of minerals, fertilizers, food, oil, and gas to disappear. We've diverted them. We don't want to be directly contributing to the Russian war effort, but it does mean that we wink, wink, nod, nod, expect other countries, emerging economies, to go and buy that. So the market volume itself doesn't get extremely dislocated, and it gives us the advantage of having our cake and eating it too. We can chide the Indians, we can finger point at them, we can appear to be sort of telling them not to buy Russian oil in public, while understanding that we need the Indians to do that.
Daniel Tannenbaum, that's about right?
No, it is. And, I wouldn't be surprised, to Sonny's point, in the coming months, again, as you look to force allies of Russia to choose strategically, if you see aid packages offered from the U.S. to India to offer the sale of military weapons. I know recently there was an approval in the Indian government to expand its purchasing of arms, mostly focused on the domestic producers. But don't be surprised to see the U.S. and its allies look to entice India to choose a side more actively with the sale of defense products. I mean, that would absolutely be within the playbook we've seen. And we're really getting to the point now where the U.S. and its allies will continue to force those on sides with Russia to choose not everything, but the things that you can source from other parts of the world. Do you want to work with 142 countries, or do you want to work with Russia and a handful of others, even though they may include the second largest economy in the world? But those choices will be coming sooner rather than later.
Yeah, some cynics saying, Daniel, that the United States seems to have found Africa on the map again. And is that thanks to the invasion of Ukraine, Joe Biden hosting a U.S.-Africa summit? We saw his vice president last week on a tour of the continent. And that's further to your point?
I have never heard the term the global south more than I have in the last 3 months, frankly. And yes, we've had Vice President Harris. You've seen the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the session that was hosted in the U.S. I think the U.S. has been reminded not to forget the Southern Hemisphere, especially when China has made fairly expansive infrastructure investments around the world to curry favor. So I would expect to see more of that as the U.S. is reminded that this is not just a Northern Hemisphere coalition, that this really needs to be a global effort. And those that need support from countries like China will continue to choose it if they're not being forced with a choice of the U.S.
All right, well, shrugging off the critics is Moscow itself. It took over the rotating presidency for 1 month of the United Nations Security Council on Saturday. It's mostly symbolic, but acts as a reminder of the diplomatic clout of a nuclear power that's got a permanent seat on the Security Council, a nuclear power that last Friday laid out a new foreign policy doctrine that clearly labels the United States as the instigator of a, quote, new type of hybrid war against Moscow. Those, Alexandra Filipenko, are the words of Russia's foreign minister. The UN Security Council, to many, it may not seem that important. We have, for instance, Salah on the hashtag F24Debate, who says, I think in the long run, Earth will need other global institutions to fulfill the role of the UN. But for now, vast swathes of the world pay attention to what happens at the United Nations.
Absolutely, and this is the framework that was set up in 1945, and now it's not collapsing, but it looks like it's at least at risk. And there is a group of lawyers and diplomats that is trying to take Russia off the Security Council and maybe even out of the UN. But because rather than formally requesting the UN membership in 1991, Russia just inherited the member status as the assignee after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it happened because Russia assumed not only this legacy, but also Soviet Union's debts. And the total debt of the Soviet Union was more than $100 billion, and Russia repaid it only in 2017. So that is why Russia sees itself as the continuation of the Soviet Union in the Security Council. And we know that President Putin sees, of course, Russia as the continuation of the Soviet Union, at least in his speeches. And Russian propagandists, they are trying to spin it, and Russian presidency, they're trying to spin the Russian presidency in the UN Security Council that really has some institutional power. Not only it's above symbolic, it's beyond symbolic, I'd rather say. The way that they are remembering the Iraq War, and they are remembering the fact that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan declared that the Iraq War was illegal. It's 2 decades ago, 20 years ago, that U.S. ground forces invaded Iraq, and that is what Russian propagandists are referring to. And they're saying that the United States bombed Yugoslavia. They are condemning it, of course, but they are asking the question and wondering why are some allowed in the Security Council and others are not? Why it is allowed to some start a war and be at the Security Council, be at the table, and others cannot. So they are trying to spin it this way. And of course, it takes some pain to follow Russian propaganda, but still, this is how they're seeing it. And for President Putin and for the Kremlin, it is very important to be seen as one of the great powers. Of course, as we've already said, economically, it's not one of the great powers, but politically, it's very important. It's of utmost importance for Moscow to be seen as one of the great powers, as a superpower that's at the table with the United States and even presiding at the table where the United States are at.
And Alexandra, further to that point Daniel Tannenbaum made about, do you want to be with the 142 nations or do you want to be isolated? For Putin, and we talked about this last week when Xi Jinping was in Moscow, how important is it that he has the backing of Beijing?
It's extremely important for Putin to have the backing of Beijing, and now he tries to show himself as, let's say, an equal to Beijing. Moscow is an equal to Beijing, not a brother, not some smaller brother, a smaller partner, a minor partner, but a real partner, a big partner. And it seems that now for Moscow, this this is the only way out of the war in Ukraine in a good way, let's say. This is the only way they can win something. They can win the loyalty of Beijing. And now within Russia, Putin is increasingly replacing the ruling mechanism with the tools of force. And those hawks in the Kremlin are getting more and more powerful right now. They're getting more and more influential. And the economic side of the war, of course, it's being felt. But the group that's been leading Russia and kept actually Russia from collapsing economically is now not that powerful. So for those hawks, of course, it's extremely important to have such a backer, such a huge backer as Beijing, as Xi, who visited Moscow, and this was extremely symbolic. And the presidency and the Security Council, everything is playing into Vladimir Putin's book, and everything is very good. It looks really good for Moscow and for Russian propaganda in the country, within the country, of course.
All right, it looks good for the information war. Anna Kreti, when there was the announcement of that second natural gas pipeline that would flow from the Arctic Circle down to towards China via Mongolia, how important was that?
Well, this kind of infrastructure takes time to be built. And nevertheless, the fact that they agree about this new investment to start is also a sign that they are going to reinforce their economic relationships. So actually, the gas that is sold to China goes still through mainly through liquefied gas. So as for oil, it goes also on the shipping side. So the question is, in the short term, is not going to affect the revenues. It is not going to create further trading opportunities, but it is something that links these two trading partnerships. It is a commitment. And therefore, since we are speaking about these two layers, one it is the political layer and the other one is the commercial, we see that the strategy of Putin is to create as much confusion as he can on the political side, and in the meantime to profit from the business opportunities with these trading partners. So we are not prepared. We were unprepared to economic sanctions. Now it is 1 year that we have those sanctions. So we start seeing whether, since it is still a partial sanction, so 70% of the countries in the world is not touched directly by the sanctions. So we still see some effects. But at the same time, they are forced by the political relationship that Putin is now reinforcing with all these satellite countries that were a little bit ambiguous at the beginning.
All right, so pressure being brought on one side, and on the other, well, we had the president of the European Commission in Paris this Monday for a working lunch with Emmanuel Macron. The pair depart together on Tuesday evening for Beijing and want to make sure they're singing from the same hymn sheet, particularly on Russia, as stated last Thursday by Ursula von der Leyen.
Any peace plan which would in effect consolidate Russian annexations is simply not a viable plan. We have to be frank on this point. How China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for EU-China relations going forward.
Sani Kapoor, what are you expecting from that joint visit by the French president and the head of the European Commission?
I think there will be two parallel tracks. One is the substance of the discussion that will play out, and the second track is what will be done and played out for the cameras for the international audience and the domestic audience on both sides. And I think the gap between those two is substantial. The fact of the matter is the EU and China are so deeply economically integrated, in particular Germany, that any threat of economic sanctions and sort of further distancing of EU-China relations is not very credible, at least not in the near term. It's very, very hard for the EU to disentangle itself economically meaningfully enough to sort of, hurt China without hurting itself very, very substantially. So I think the EU does not carry a very big, credible stick going into this. That having been said, I think that, and lip service has been paid to the so-called China peace plan. And perhaps Macron and von der Leyen might manage to convince President Xi to put some sort of, substance into what otherwise looks like, just a grand statement devoid of any actionable meaning for now. And yes, China is an important actor. China is critical as a potential leverage point to put pressure on Russia. And what China decides in terms of how far it is able to, willing to go against the global community, against the West, to support Putin versus saying, okay, this is where we draw the line. And much of that is going to happen behind closed doors. I think that is what ought to be the focus.
Many thanks, Sunny Kapoor. I want to thank you so much for joining us from Oslo. I want to thank Daniel Tannenbaum in New York City, Alexandra Filipenko in Vilnius, and Akredi. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.